Hello, everyone, and welcome to Radio 2. This is lesson 39 of the 84 lessons that we're going to be doing together. And this time around, we're chatting about speciality broadcasting, right? So I'm going to take you through it and let you know why it is so important. Specifically, we're going to be chatting about tragedies that occur and that you can find in your next level radio textbook on page 166 up to 168. Let's get into it. Speciality shows. Speciality shows are shows that go against the grain of regular programming. They are different in sound and content and to the rest of the shows on the station. In other words, they are programmed differently. These can be specifically designed as weekly or daily shows. Or these shows happen in times of tragedy when radio stations, to reflect the mood of the community, deliberately modify their programming. The weekly or daily speciality shows are created to cater to a slightly different core target market of a radio station and to attract a different audience. Commercially, these shows are about bringing in different groups of people that would not ordinarily be catered for through normal programming. 5 December 2013, the day that South African broadcasting had been preparing for, but were hoping would never arrive. This is the day that Nelson Mandela died. It was the moment in which radio stations across the country got to throw away the format book, the music policies, and all the regulatory restrictions and just be real. The country was in mourning, and it was the job of every radio station to capture the nation's mood. Most radio stations had imaging, packaging, and audio on standby, but it was not this aspect that made radio so brilliant over this time. It was the fact that every presenter and every caller became vulnerable, intimate, and real. It was an incredible few days in which radio showed that it can be the greatest companion and that it has the ability to truly connect with the people. On this day, South African broadcasters learned how they could become the go-to medium where tragedy hits. Let's reflect on these few days of broadcasting. Firstly, South African broadcasting had the opportunity to truly reflect the mood of the country. They took callers, they allowed them to cry, they allowed them to share intimate emotions. When other tragedies hit or sensitive topics arise, allow your listeners to be open and honest and to share their experiences and feelings with you. During this time, music stations did not leave the news to the news stations. They integrated it into their programming and gave listeners all the information they needed. Music stations were teaming up with news partners to make sure that the news was credible and reliable. Radio stations reacted quickly and took charge of the situation. Many took it upon themselves to organize vigils outside Mandela's house in Houghton, and others gave away candles and letters for their listeners in which personal stories were written to the Mandela family. Take note of this approach. Music radio stations played music that best summed up the mood. Music radio is the perfect position to bring listeners together through the power of music. In such times, one should throw out the usual playlist and reflect the mood through song. Presenters were real and vulnerable, but made it about the listeners, not about themselves. The nation turned to radio for information about the events after Nelson Mandela's passing and to be the shoulder to cry on. Everything was focused on the listeners, not the presenters. It is crucial in such times to be there for listeners emotionally and to reflect on their experiences. This is the same for very sensitive topics. Presenters should allow their communities to reflect on how they feel. To emphasize, presenters should not make these moments about themselves. I remember a moment like this quite vividly when the Archbishop Desmond Tutu passed away. I was on my way to do a stand-in and I heard the news of Desmond Tutu's passing on my way to 947. I then got a call from our station manager, Ravi, who said, Noni, a lot is going to change. And I know I'm putting you under a lot of pressure, but we obviously have to change programming. So all my ideas about what's going to happen on the show had to be thrown out the window because we now had to focus on the death of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. When I got to the station at the time, unfortunately, the music department was not available, which meant that I manually had to restructure the playlist of the radio station. So I really had to remove all the songs that were, exciting and happy, like you would listen to on a Saturday. And I then had to change the mood of the show to truly reflect the mood of Desmond Tutu's passing. Liners in between were dedicated to Desmond Tutu. So the normal 947, or you're listening to 947 jingles, were then thrown away, and we then were playing Desmond Tutu's jingles in between the songs. Again, a very tough time for me, considering that I then had to select songs that reflected the mood for an entire 3 hours. I was definitely under a lot of pressure, but I do think that I came out quite victorious. It was a very difficult time as well, for myself included, but as a presenter of the radio show, I had to make sure that the content was not about me, but about the listeners. I gave the listeners an opportunity to reflect on the experiences with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we also worked very closely with EWN, as the programming had to change, obviously, and we had to keep tabs on what the updates were with regards to his memorial services as well as his funeral. We caught up with the ladies working in the newsroom. We spoke to them as well at the top and at the bottom of the hour, again, to truly reflect on the mood of what was happening during the time that Desmond Tutu passed. Again, a very interesting experience for me, a very tough one as well, but as a broadcaster, it had to be done. Now let's think about COVID-19. How did radio programming change at the time? Again, I remember the first day of lockdown, I could hear birds chirping. I could hear them for the very first time in a very long time. The world stood still. There was not a single sound coming from outside. No cars were driving by, because everybody was indoors and we were quite scared about, what was happening outside. And I remember thinking, these few couple of days of us being indoors could be a very long time. And again, radio became the companion for many of us, where we would then continue listening to our favorite radio stations, who gave us an update about what they saw on their way to work, what they were feeling when they were at the station, some of the experiences of the presenters, some who caught COVID-19 and had to either be hospitalized or had to quarantine. So radio did become our companion, and it became the only place for us as listeners to truly connect with one another, because we could no longer go to the office, we could no longer go to the mall, we could no longer go to church, go to casinos, go to restaurants. So all we really had was radio to truly fill us in on what was happening around the world, and as well as what was happening in our communities. So obviously, programming really had to change and be geared towards COVID-19 content. And even though it wasn't just the news and the updates of COVID-19, but stories of how people got through COVID-19, stories from the presenters that became content pieces as well. Stay connected during difficult times. Don't just report the events, but feel them, because your audience will too. Make recordings on the streets of locals. Ask what they saw, heard, or how they feel. Tragedies allow presenters and shows to step out of their content comfort zone and to discuss what else can be done to add layers to the content. If the show is aimed at parents, ask how parents can explain the event to their children. Open up debates and ask hard questions. Find a personal way to deal with tragedies that have multiple casualties. Radio stations must do everything that they can to help their communities. Allow your listeners to share their feelings on air and on your social media. What I want us to do now is to turn to your next level radio textbook. I will give you a second to get that out. And I want us to look at the question 3 from activity 4C. And that you'll find on page 168. All right, 168 is the page where we are headed towards. Activity 4C reads as follows. You are the programming manager of a well-known youth station. So think YFM, of course, like the logo in the background. List 3 things you would immediately do upon hearing that a high-profile and much-loved politician has passed away. All right. So took you through some of the things I then had to do when we heard these news and I was on my way to actually deliver the show. And as I said, Ravi was so involved, fully understanding the responsibility that was on me at that moment. And he took me through everything, each and every time, and ensured that myself and EWN were well connected and that our information was credible and reliable. So let's see, if you were the programming manager of a well-known news station, what are some things that you would start considering if you heard that a high-profile politician has passed away? So let's go through some of the answers in the back of your textbook. Here are some of the following actions that you can follow through with as a programming manager. Add feelings to the reports, show vulnerability, and reflect the mood of your listeners. Record the reactions and views of ordinary people on the street. Find experts who can deliver their analysis opinions on what has happened. For shows aimed to parents, ask how parents can explain to their children what has actually happened. Start debates and ask questions that are serious in nature, such as questions concerning government policies. Put a human face on the victims. Talk about who they were and how they lived. Approach artists for the purpose of holding a benefits concert. Give listeners the opportunity to share their feelings on air as well as on social media. All right, those are some of the answers that you can get from the textbook, but I do also encourage you to do the other questions in 4C. I do think they're pivotal and they're important, so make sure you go through those. Otherwise, I will check you out in the next lesson. We'll be looking at compiling music. If you have any questions for me, we do have a Radio 2 WhatsApp group that you can contact me through. If it's something a little bit more private, you can definitely send me a DM on WhatsApp. Alternatively, you can email me at nonhlanhla@boston.co.za. Otherwise, check you on the flip side.